I'll read from you Genesis 41, 45 through 52. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, so Joseph, and went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of those 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food into the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stirred up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. You may be seated.
Good morning. It's good to be with you today. Thank you for your attendance here in the first service back together. I really am looking forward to the time when we can all be back together. We're working out some bugs, and I'm confident we'll get those worked out over time, and hopefully this bug that's going around the world will be worked out in time as well. God bless you all. Thank you for being here. It's good to see eyeballs looking back at me. Now when you go to sleep, I'll know it, see. Sunday morning TV is often interesting, if not comical. At least it is that way for me. A few weeks ago, I was watching a popular televangelist who was hawking his miracle prayer cloths, and they were only $10, so a pretty good deal. And he brings up to the stage a woman clutching one of the miracle prayer cloths, and the preacher encouraged her to tell her story. And she said, I told God that all I needed was $5,000. Lord, if I just had $5,000, all my problems would go away. And ever since I've begun to pray with this prayer cloth, man, God's blessings are just raining down on me. God has opened the floodgates of heaven, and I've received not $5,000, but $10,000. This miracle prayer cloth really works. See, sometimes the danger with preaching the Joseph story is that people see Joseph's faithfulness in his suffering that we talked about last week. And we see then how God rewards him for his faithfulness. And they think, you know what? If I just walk the straight and narrow pathway, God's going to make me rich too. And there is no shortage of preachers who preach that on a regular basis. It's known as the health and wealth gospel. So before we get into the sermon today, let me just say that your financial or medical well-being might improve if you walk more closely with God, but it might not. In fact, it might grow worse. We talked a few weeks back, may have actually been on a Sunday night as I remember it, or maybe one of the online devos, about how our lives are always kind of a mix of blessing and burden, aren't they? And that God knows how much of each one of us needs. That God will allow us just the right balance of blessing and burden. We've all noticed that some people suffer more than other people. Some have more blessing than other people. And that balance will shift from time to time in our own lives. There are times in my life when things have been going so well that there has been so much abundance in my life that I've felt guilty about it. God, why are you blessing me so much? And I know that he's saying, so you can be a blessing to others, Jim. At other times, our suffering can be so great that we wonder if we're going to survive it. And like David, we cry out, "Where are you, Lord? Why me, Lord? Why does it feel that you're so far away from me?" So burden and blessing. Not enough and too much. Isn't it wonderful that we serve a God who, in his divine wisdom and steadfast love, knows just how much of each that we need so that we can become more like him? This is what Joseph has experienced in the first 30 years of his life. Last week we saw Joseph rise from the pit to the pinnacle, didn't we? God gave him the opportunity to use his blessing of interpretation, and Joseph used it and gave all the glory to God. It's not my word, Pharaoh, this is God's word. And then Joseph used the blessing of wisdom to lay out a plan to save during the 7 years of abundance so that they could withstand the coming 7 years of famine. He tells Pharaoh, you need to find a really smart guy to implement this plan and then see it through. And Pharaoh, in his wisdom, says, Joseph, it sure seems to me like you're the guy. I put you in charge of everything except me, Pharaoh says. So you make it work. And he gives Joseph, you remember, the royal Egyptian clothing and the fine jewelry, gives him a company car to drive, and even the signet ring that Pharaoh wore, that he would sign laws with and pay bills with and issue orders with. And as Jason just read to us, Pharaoh also gives Joseph an Egyptian name. It is hard to say exactly what the name means, but scholars think it means something like the God speaks and lives, or the God knows. There's a syllable in the name, Nath, which is an Egyptian goddess. And the wife, you notice, has the same syllable in her name, which means something along the lines of belonging to the God. And so within this short amount of time, really within just a day, Joseph's life has completely changed. Instead of being a forgotten nobody in the pit, he's suddenly transformed into somebody everybody knows, someone to whom people should bow the knee. He has authority, he has popularity, and he has prosperity. And the question then becomes, how's he going to handle that? Vince Young is a name most of us will remember from the 2005 Rose Bowl, the MVP of that game, led his team to an unlikely come-from-behind victory, winning the national championship that year. Vince then later on was the third player taken in the NFL draft, drafted in the first round by the Tennessee Titans. Signed a guaranteed contract for $58 million. And he would go on to play quarterback for 3 different teams over the next 6 seasons in the NFL. But he had the reputation for living a pretty fast life. He would buy $300 shots of cognac after every victory, rumored to have spent around $5,000 a week feeding family and friends at a local eating establishment. A series of bad investments left Vince Young penniless, and in 2016 he declared bankruptcy, and just last year he was arrested for a second time for DWI and was fired from his job at the University of Texas. In Scripture, we recall the parable that Jesus tells that we call the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus teaches about a young man who takes half his father's estate and wastes it in riotous living. And so we know that it's a very old and very common story. A fool and his money are soon parted. Well, here's Joseph, fresh out of prison, handed everything a man could ever want. He has power, position, wealth, fame, a fast car, a beautiful wife. Got it all. How's he going to handle it? See, I'm not real sure that the 17-year-old Joseph that we met the very first week, the one who loved to tell his family about his dreams of them bowing down to him, I don't know if that Joseph would have done too well with all this prosperity. But that Joseph is gone. This is new Joseph. This is now the 30-year-old Joseph who's been through some things. He's been in the pit not just once, but a couple of times. He's had a good measure of authority handed to him by Potiphar, you remember, before then finding himself caught in a trap with Potiphar's wife. He spent 2 years in the pit being shaped by God, refined and purified by God, learning how to trust. And this new Joseph, he's ready for this prosperity. He's going to handle it well. As our brother read, he executes God's plan to perfection, and in the 7 years of plenty, Joseph uses his authority to store up food in every Egyptian city. His plan was, you remember, to save 20% each year. I'm convinced he saved a whole lot more than that God's blessing was in such abundance that he saved up a lot more than 20%. Look again at verse 49 of our text. It says, "And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured." In no way is the blessing of God squandered by Joseph. Instead, he honors God. He honors what God has done for this nation by carrying out God's plan. And Joseph understands that ultimately he's accountable to God for how he works this plan and how he uses the blessings of God. And because Joseph is devoted to the plan given to him by God, God continues to bless him. 2 sons are born to Joseph and his wife in the last year of the plenty. The first son Joseph names Manasseh, which sounds like the Hebrew word for forget. Joseph says, "My God has helped me forget my mistreatment in my daddy's house." The second son he names Ephraim, which sounds like the Hebrew word meaning twice fruitful. Joseph says, "God has given me not just one son, but 2 sons. I am fruitful in this land of my affliction." And many years later, when Israel enters the promised land and divides the land up into tribes, you remember there is no tribe of Joseph, is there? Instead, there are 2 tribes, a double portion for Joseph, named after his boys, Manasseh and Ephraim. There's something else I think that's worth noting about our text this morning, and that is the fact that Joseph is the husband of one wife. He doesn't fall into the trap that Abraham fell into with Hagar and Sarah. He doesn't fall into the trap that his daddy fell into, taking 2 wives, one of whom he loved and the other one not so much. No, Joseph has decided he's going to be a one-woman man. He sticks with the plan that God set up in the beginning with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The plan that Jesus endorses in Matthew chapter 19, where he says, "The 2 shall become one flesh," not 2 or more become one flesh. And Jesus says, it's been this way since the beginning. Young single people, I cannot emphasize this enough. Choose your spouse wisely. Don't marry a bad boy because he's fun to be around, believing that after the wedding you can kind of bring him along. That rarely works. Most of the time, the bad boy you date is the bad boy you're stuck with for the rest of your life. And so, young men and women, choose carefully. Find yourself one person who loves God and loves you and is going to be a good parent to your children. And you commit yourself to that one person and you stay with them for the rest of your life. That's God's plan, and that's what Joseph did. Joseph does not allow this newfound authority and popularity and prosperity to go to his head. Instead, he acts with accountability and humility and integrity in accordance with the purposes of God. Well, let's finish out the section to see the results of Joseph's hard work. We're going to pick up where we left off in verse 53. Scripture says, the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go see Joseph. What he says to you to do, do it." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. Now, the writer makes it clear that this is a severe famine, doesn't he? Widespread. Not just in Egypt, this is a worldwide problem, kind of like COVID-19. It's affecting everybody. And so what does Joseph do out of the abundance of his heart? He opens up the storehouses, not just to the Egyptian people, but to the whole world. He allows them to buy the food that they need. And I'm convinced that he didn't price gouge like so many in our world do today, selling toilet paper and Purell at a premium price. No, Joseph charges a fair price because he knows he's accountable to God. But then when the rest of the world comes knocking on the door, Joseph allows them to purchase food as well. God blessed Joseph with the foreknowledge of what was going to happen, and Joseph never took personal advantage. He never used his authority for his own personal gain. He could have told the surrounding countries to go pound sand, but he didn't. In humility, he operates with integrity, and he shares what he has. And isn't it something that after the 7 years of plenty and the people were crying out for food, that Pharaoh was still able to say, you have a problem with food, you need to go talk to Joseph, and if you're smart, you'll do what Joseph tells you to do. I trust with him to deal with you in fairness. Now, in 38 years of my work in the secular world, I've had some pretty sorry bosses. Some I would call jerks. Maybe you've had a jerk boss. Maybe you have one now. I had bosses who would take my ideas and claim them as his own. I had bosses who never complimented my work and never gave me a pay raise. I had one boss that I had to beat him to the bank to cash my paycheck because it was going to bounce if I didn't. I've had bosses who treated employees unfairly. Bosses who looked out only for themselves. That's not Joseph. He could have been a jerk. Instead, he chose to operate with accountability, humility, and integrity. And I think those three ingredients are critical if we're going to stay faithful in times of abundance. And so I'd like to end the sermon this morning with three takeaways. First of all, abundant authority requires abundant accountability. Joseph knows he's accountable to Pharaoh for sure. You can bet that Pharaoh's watching Joseph as well, not micromanaging him, but keeping an eye. Joseph has presented Pharaoh with a plan, and he's accountable for implementing that plan and executing that plan. But ultimately, Joseph's accountability is to God. It's God who's blessed Joseph with this authority. And so Joseph honors God by carrying out God's plan. Now, he could have hoarded everything for himself. He could have lined his own pockets during the 7 years of prosperity, and certainly in the 7 years of famine. He could have made off like Bernie Madoff, but he didn't. He held himself accountable to God for his newfound authority. Sometimes authority is abused, isn't it? Most recently, we saw authority abused by a rogue police officer who murdered a subdued, harmless black man, believing that because he's a person of authority, he won't be held accountable. He's finding out that he's held accountable. In church like Joseph, we will be held accountable for how we use our authority. And you may be thinking to yourself, authority? I don't have any authority. You do. Parents have authority over their children. Employers have authority over their employees. We all have a God-given authority over creation and how we treat others. We have authority over how we use our blessings and our opportunities. Jesus asked this in Luke chapter 12, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, 'My master is taking a long time in coming,' and then he begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, and to eat and to drink and to get drunk. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect them, and at an hour he is unaware of, and he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers." The words of Jesus: "The servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready or does not do what the master wants will be beaten with many blows. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." With authority comes accountability. We will be held accountable for how we exercise authority. Secondly, abundant popularity requires abundant humility. Now, if anybody had a reason to become prideful and arrogant, it's Joseph. I mean, he really does have it all. Wearing his Armani suit, his Mercedes-Benz, he's on the road, he's wearing gold and diamonds. He has servants who go before him saying, "Bow the knee to this fella." And yet Joseph knows that everything he's been given is for a reason. That it's not about him. It's not about how good he's been or how faithful he's been. It's not about his goodness at all. He doesn't deserve one thing that he's been given. It's all come by the grace of God, and he knows it. It's been given by God, and it belongs to God, and it's to be used for God's glory, not Joseph's glory. And is the same thing not true for us? Life is not about how much money you have in the bank or what kind of car you drive or how big your house is. It is irrelevant how many people know your name and show respect to you. None of that's going to matter when Jesus comes back. And trust me, on that day, he won't be the one bowing the knee when you stand before him. So let's lose the pride. It ain't about us. It's all about God. And on that day, I don't want anything from him except grace. Guess who gets God's grace? Listen to the apostle in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. "Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you." Paul exhorts us in Philippians chapter 2 to have the mind of Christ. Think the way Jesus thought. And in verse 3 he writes, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as better than yourselves." It was F. Scott Fitzgerald who said, "Never forget who you are and where you come from." Joseph's popularity doesn't mean anything to him. He knows that if it weren't for God, he'd still be down in that pit. No room for pride. And finally, point number 3, abundant prosperity requires abundant integrity. And I want to tell you, church, that some of the most wonderful members in the family of God who are those who have continued to walk in integrity as God has blessed them with wealth by His grace. And they use that wealth for God's glory. I've been part of ministries that have benefited greatly from those who have very little, and from those who, like Joseph, have a lot, and they're willing to part with it so that God's plan and purposes can be furthered. See, God puts rich people into our church. He put rich people into the ministry of Jesus. Luke chapter 8 says that the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. And Susanna and many others who provided for Jesus and the 12 out of their own means. After Jesus' death at the cross, God provided a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph who was willing to part with his tomb so that finally the Son of Man would have a place to lay his head. Some of our members here at Southern Hills have a little change in their pocket, and they're always willing to share when needs come up. We had a lot of folks come to our elders saying, "Look, if anybody in the congregation has lost their job, if they're having a hard time paying the rent or paying the light bill, if this quarantine is hurting them financially, you let us know. We have money to share." I thank God for those members whom God has placed in our midst who are willing to extravagantly give of their means. God has a purpose. He has a plan for us individually and collectively. He will bless us with just what we need to implement His plan. May we never squander the blessings of God, but because we know we are accountable to Him, may we act in humility and integrity to carry out His divine purposes. May we all remember that in comparison to most people in the world today, you and I are filthy rich. And to whom much is given, much will be required. Elders and ministers are available for prayer this morning. If there's something going on in your life that you'd like to pray about, I will remind again the folks in the auditorium, we have some this morning who are with us grieving. I pray that you'll give them a word of encouragement. Maintain your 6 feet, but let them know you're thinking about them and praying for them and you're hurting with them. That's really important. If you'd like to pray with the elders this morning, we have some in attendance. You can grab them and their wives. They would be happy to go into a private room and pray with you. And if we have anyone this morning who's ready to confess Jesus as Lord and put Him on in baptism, I will be down front here at the end of service. Come and see me. We'll round everybody up to witness a baptism. That would be a great thing if it happened this morning. At this time, one of our shepherds, Brother Chuck Meisenheimer, will come and offer the shepherd's prayer.